There was lots of speculation, wasn't there, that Lavrov and Putin had fallen out. For what I gather, I mean, one of the things, it's all very well having an autocrat like Putin, but the real power lies in some of the people around him, some of the oligarchs, because ultimately, when they realize that life is just getting worse and worse, they're the people who normally bring a dictator's life to an end. And therefore, the whole breakup with Lavrov, whatever the truth was, it is just interesting to see that frictions are just starting to appear. But the harsh reality, going to your core of your question, is the difficult situation at Pokrovsk on the front line. Is that something that President Putin is actually ready to negotiate about? I think it's highly unlikely. I think what's far more likely is over the last few weeks, you've seen President Trump start to harden his view a little bit more to Russia. He's starting to talk about more sanctions with any countries that are doing deals, buying energy from Russia. We've heard overnight more Ukrainian attacks over Russian energy infrastructure, none of which is going to bring the war to an end tomorrow, but all of which ramps up pressure on President Putin. The one thing that I think we're going to see a bit more on the table will be these Tomahawk cruise missiles. You'll remember that it appeared that President Putin was worried about those, and that's what prompted him to call President Trump and stop him issuing those to Ukraine. But I do sense that America's patience is gradually wearing thin with Putin. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we may not see Tomahawks, but we may see more and more American support for long-range missile strikes. And in addition, it's not just the missiles that potentially the West could give Ukraine, but also helping Ukraine develop their own. There's quite a few missiles at the moment that Ukraine has been using. The Neptune missile, we understand, was what struck the oil fields the other night. That's a Ukrainian missile. And the Flamingo is another missile, long-range missile, developed by Ukraine, but with the help of the West. They get past some of the diplomatic challenges, so we say, of giving missiles to Ukraine. If they can develop their own, they don't have to do any testing. They just send them off. And if they work, fantastic. And we're seeing more and more effect there. So the short answer is, I don't think we're going to see President Putin suing for peace anytime soon, unless Trump pulls some of the levers that he has available, and then we might see some movement.
So is this a kind of key area that Ukraine and its allies can kind of needle in towards Putin and the Kremlin? Because, Russia's Novorossiysk port is just today, it's one of the biggest Russian oil export ports. It's just today resuming oil exports after a 2-day pause following Ukrainian drone attacks. Putin himself has actually been in meetings with Rosneft, which was one of the sanctioned companies that was sanctioned by the US very recently. Is that pressure starting to build? Do you think this is something that Russia will actually sit up and listen to, whereas earlier they've kind of tried to push away the economic situation as just a sort of economic management issue and something they could deal with a larger war economy?
I think this is at the heart of the question, to be honest, Louis. I think you can either... the war will stop when Putin achieves his military objectives. We can speculate what they are, but it looks very likely that they are Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, as well as securing Crimea as well. He hasn't done that yet. And it might be that just to secure Donetsk could actually take 2 or 3 more years. The only other ways that this is going to end is either Putin is forced to militarily or economically. It doesn't look like there's any appetite in the West to get involved militarily. But I have to say there's more and more talk about the West putting a no-fly zone in place. There are risks associated with that. But I think the big strategic error that President Putin made was by, 19 drones that went into Polish airspace, some into Romania, the 3 fighter jets that went into Estonian airspace. All of those were avoidable. And if President Putin can't be trusted not to attack NATO, then NATO is entirely justified in pushing out its boundary and creating a no-fly zone to protect its airspace. And by doing that over some, not all, but some of Ukraine, I think is one way that they could ramp up the pressure on President Putin at minimum risk. But the only other way, as you say, is doing sanctions. I, as a warfighter, I have to say I'm somewhat cynical about sanctions, but I do I'm also aware that there are now fuel shortages in some parts of Russia. That's building up pressure. It's also that the exports aren't generating the money that used to come in, and that's funding. Was it 40% of national spending in Russia is now on defense? It's costing a fortune, this war. It's a lot of people. Over 1 million Russians have died. The whole fact of this, the impact on the society and on its economy, all of which is gradually ramping up pressure. Will that cause Putin to come to the table? Probably not soon, but the further that pressure ramps up, the more unstable Putin's position becomes internally, and that will be something that will worry him.
And I do want to come on to some of the geopolitics of this, especially attacks on Europe, as we've seen quite developments in Poland in the last few hours. But just finally on the air attacks on Russia, Ukraine's Centre for Countering Disinformation is claiming that Russia's struggling to defend energy sites, in part because a lot of these air defences that they would be using are needed at the front lines in Ukraine. How difficult are these decisions for militaries about where to utilise air defences? And does it seem that Russia has been slightly caught out here with something of a shortage or an inability to bring enough defences in to cover their energy infrastructure?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the trouble is with air defences, they range from a man lying on his back with an AK-47 pointing into the sky. That doesn't cost very much, and you could probably have quite a lot of those. But that's not very much use against cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. If you go at the high end, the only real defence against ballistic missiles is incredibly expensive missile systems. You know, we talk a lot about the American Patriot system. You're talking about $1 billion. I'll say that again, $1 billion per unit. So if Louis was responsible for protecting the UK and I gave you 5 of those systems, where would you position them? Would it be around the military bases that are actually doing the war fighting? Would it be around your politicians in the centre of London? It's an incredibly difficult decision to make. And Russia is a vast country. A lot of the oil infrastructure is spread in the middle of nowhere, and therefore very, very difficult when you have these limited resources to work out. So, they will all have some formal protections against some of the slower drones. As soon as you get onto the more capable missiles, particularly some of the ones that are being developed, like the Flamingo missile or the other missiles that Ukraine have been using, a lot more difficult. You need specialist equipment, particularly the Neptune missile, and therefore that is something Russia does not have in large quantities and therefore has to prioritize.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.